I've heard one person say this. He said, it's interesting that sometimes God calls people into ministry or into service because he knows that is what it's going to be. That's going to be the thing that helps them grow, that helps them stay faithful. And this is part of, and so you say, oh, well, I'm not in ministry, so I guess that doesn't apply to me. No. Everybody is called to take part in this mission of God through Jesus. If you're a Christian, you're called to be part of the family business, which is serving. Yeah. Right? And serving others and being part of God's mission of seeking and saving the lost and furthering the kingdom of God. And so every person in the church, we always say, join a group, join a team. We want everyone in the church serving. Why? Because Jesus is servant. That's how we become like him. But also, that is part of the discipleship process. It's not just how we get stuff done. It's how we grow people.
Well, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra, where we dig a little deeper into last week's sermon, or actually this week's sermon, either one, depending on when you're watching this. It could be any sermon. But my name is Pastor Jason. This is Pastor Nick. And if you like what you're seeing this week, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make sure you smash that like button as well. It really helps us out with the algorithms. And if you ever miss a sermon, by the way, you can always check out whitefieldschurch.com, or you can download our app, Whitefields app, as well. So, we're currently traveling through a sermon series entitled Equipped to Serve, and we kind of threw on a bonus sermon, really, entitled Charged It to My Account, and it's about the book of Philemon. It's short and sweet, and it's a powerful book. And there was a lot of questions that really arose from Philemon. And in the first couple of verses, it talks about the house church and how the house church is basically the norm of the time you talked about in the sermon. So why did they do the house church, and should we be doing house churches here?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to define what a church is when we think about how should we do church. And there can be this tendency to say whatever they did in the early church, we should try to emulate now, because obviously there was a move of the Spirit and things were sweet. Maybe they'd say it was closer to the original. I would just say clearly, I don't think that we should just be copying everything we see in the early church, but it is worth noting why he mentions the church that meets in your house. By the way, there are other references in the New Testament to churches meeting in houses. There's one at the end of the book of Romans, for example, and I know of one other that's not coming to my mind right now, but I know that there are 3 references to churches that meet in people's houses in the New Testament. Let me just explain a little bit of the context behind that. Here's what it was. In the early Christian church, basically, as soon as it became clear that Christianity was distinct from Judaism, so a little bit early on, Christians were able to kind of fly under the radar as being the fulfillment of Judaism and part of Judaism. Maybe some people, would pejoratively refer to it as a Jewish sect, but they would go into synagogues. But after a while, right, the synagogues, when they became talking about Jesus, it became clear there's a line in the sand. You're either following Jesus or you're not following Jesus. And those who didn't want to follow Jesus as the Messiah, they stayed in the synagogue, whereas the Christians were pushed out. And then we see that they started gathering in homes. Now, the reason for that is because at this time, up until 314 AD, the Christian church, or Christianity in the Roman Empire, its legal status was what it was called in Latin, religia illicitas, which means illicit religion. And what that means is it was kind of like the church in China today, the underground Protestant church, the church in Iran, where there are many people. Some of these, they aren't necessarily secret gatherings. Some of them are very out in the open in public, but they don't have any legal protection. They don't have any legal status. And as such, you couldn't get permission to build property or buy property. And so what they would do is they would gather in people's homes. So let's say in a city like Corinth or Colossae or Ephesus, what you would have is, let's say there's 200 people in the church. Well, you would break up those 200 people into multiple gatherings that would gather at people's homes. And then those groups would be led by elders, and they would gather on the Lord's Day, on Sunday, for communion, singing, worship, and study. And so they would do that. They would oftentimes meet first thing in the morning at dawn on Sunday. Remember that also Sunday was a work day up until around 380 AD. And so Sunday's a work day. You meet before work at the dawn of the new day when Jesus was resurrected. They remember that. Plus, there's symbolism around the dawn as the new day dawning with Jesus Christ and the eschatological hope that we have in him. And then they would meet after work in the evening, which also makes sense when you read, like it says that Paul, I think it's Acts chapter 20, is that right? Where Paul, it's either 20 or 21, where Paul goes and he preaches and the guy falls out of the window.
Oh, right, yeah.
Well, part of the reason the guy falls out of the window is because he's been working all day.
Yeah.
And then Paul says that he preached for a really long time. And this guy fell asleep, leaning against, probably trying to get some fresh air because it's probably stuffy in there as well. He falls out of the window, dies, Paul revives him, etc. Okay, all that to say, the church was organized in this way out of necessity. And what's interesting is that as soon as the church was allowed to build and buy properties, dedicated buildings for worship, that's exactly what they did. So starting with the Edict of Toleration, then they began building churches, dedicated church facilities that could hold bigger groups of people where they could gather, not just in people's homes. And another thing that's really interesting is that that was really only the situation in the Roman Empire. And remember, Christianity was spreading in all directions at this time. It was spreading into northern Africa. It was spreading into the Silk Road. Some of the earliest Christians, they were actually essentially all killed off, unfortunately. But there were churches, and there's still remnants of these churches along the Silk Road in what we now call Central Asia and into like outer Mongolia. And then another part of this is that the Apostle Thomas led a movement that went to India. And so they went to the state of what's now Kerala, India, and there are Christians there called Martoma Christians, which means St. Thomas Christians. And they're actually the oldest church building in the world is in India. It dates from the 2nd century AD, and it is a dedicated church building. The oldest church building in the Roman Empire, that territory, is in modern-day Syria. And it's called Dura Europus. And this is essentially what's interesting about it is it's two houses that were built together with like a corridor between them. But you can tell they didn't pull permits to do this, right? They did this kind of like under the radar. Maybe officials knew about it, but they were kind of trying to keep it on the down low. And it was two houses next to each other, which maybe they bought, maybe they were owned by Christians, and they built a corridor between them. And then they built it out inside to be a fit for worship, but it would have fit into all of the surrounding community. Nowadays, what's interesting about that place, it's these two houses with this corridor between them, and there's nothing else around it.
Right.
But in that time, it was part of a city, it was part of a town, and that existed there. So all that to say, they did this out of necessity. As soon as they had the opportunity to not be gathering in this way, then they started doing it differently. And outside the Roman Empire, they did it differently. So the question, should we have house churches today? Should we not? I think there are definitely some benefits to doing it. I think there are also some downsides to doing it. Again, that's why I say we need to decide what is a church, what is a legitimate church, and then do those things that a church does. Our approach here is that we have the ability and the space and the legal status to be able to gather more people. And I think that, in a larger church, as the church is able to grow, you're able to reach people in a different way. A lot of people in our society, community nowadays are not going to be open to going into somebody's home, somebody they didn't meet. And so that's going to limit the scope of that churches reach in some cases. But like I said, I'm not against home churches, nor am I particularly for them. I think that churches can have different expressions.
Right.
And I think that that's a good and wonderful thing, that we can be the body of Christ and that there's diversity in those expressions. So yeah, I know places around the world where it makes more sense for churches to gather in homes. I know places in the United States where it makes more sense for churches to gather in homes. And I know places where it doesn't make sense. I have a friend who's a pastor in Inglewood, California, and he told me something really interesting. He said, in a lot of like suburban churches, you get this emphasis on like encouragement to do home groups, and that people can build community and open their homes, have people in there, etc. He said, well, where I live in the hood, you can't do that
Yeah, it'd
because
be dangerous.
because nobody trusts strangers coming into their home because it's not uncommon for people's houses to get cased by somebody and then they'll come back later. And so
Yeah.
they're not open to having strangers just come into their home or open their home up to strangers. There's higher rates of crime and things like that. And so that's a case where it's like, well, it actually, even he goes, we'll have fellowship groups, but they meet at a third location rather than in somebody's house. Right. So there's some
Yeah.
cultural things to be considered in the midst of this as well. So, yeah, I think that, there's different expressions of what the church can look like in different places and in different times. And I think that that's all well and good. So
Yeah.
you take the context that you're in into consideration as to how you should do those things, and you move forward from there. In our movement of churches in Calvary Chapel, it's been very common for church plants to start as home Bible studies and then grow out from there.
It's true.
But that doesn't mean that it's the only way to do it. There's also been plenty of models of, starting differently than that. So, yeah.
That's true. Very thorough answer. I think that answers a lot of questions that people may have about that topic. Another topic actually that came up, really that you spoke of, is that power dynamic between Philemon, who's a slave owner or owner of these bondservants, and then Onesimus, who is a bondservant. And I thought it was really fascinating, and a lot of people resonated, or maybe not resonated, but, we don't have a lot of the masters and slaves nowadays, but they really started talking about how you explained that in a church, those power dynamics in those days would completely disappear or even switch. Turn upside down. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Christianity upended the social order. I mean, it was a totally countercultural movement in so many ways. And by the way, it still is that, right? So
Absolutely.
The way that we use power within the church and within the family of God is different than the way that power is used in the world. The way that we, essentially, and that's based on what God has done for us, that he used his power to go low and lift us up when he didn't have to, right? And so that changes the way that we then live from now on in relation to other people. It's interesting that Paul is appealing to Onesimus, even though Paul is Onesimus's superior as an apostle. And, usually it is a person with less power who appeals to a person with more power.
Yeah.
But here we see a reversal of that. We see Paul appealing to someone, even though he doesn't have to, but he wants to, because he knows that that's how growth takes place. Growth doesn't take place through coercion. You might get the right outcome through coercion, but you haven't changed the heart and the intent of the person you're working with. And so we care not just about getting the right results, we care about the way we get the results. We always say this, that if you're going to do God's work, you have to do it in God's way. Right? So you can get the outcome you want in a way that's not helpful. And so that's a really different thing. But yeah, just this idea that in the Christian church, there's some early writings from Roman officials where they were writing to each other about Christians. And I've mentioned this recently, but one of the things they say is they kind of speak disparagingly, almost mockingly of Christians in those days, because they say, oh, Christians, they first of all, they called them atheists because they didn't believe in this big pantheon. They only believed in one God.
Right.
And they're basically atheists.
Yeah,
right?
one is none.
Yeah. So then they said, these atheists, first of all, they said they not only care for their own poor, but they're putting us to shame by taking care of our poor as well, even people who don't agree with what they believe. But another thing they pointed out, and this was the mocking part, is that they said, Christian gatherings, it's just a bunch of slaves and women. And they said, ha, 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 yeah, slaves and women.
Yeah.
Well, of course it was slaves and women who were drawn to these groups because they were treated badly in society. They had fewer rights. They were not, their testimony wasn't accepted in court, right? Because they weren't considered to be fully fledged adults, if you will. And so what you see with Christianity is just this total reversal of power dynamics, this total upending of things, where people who had no dignity in society are given dignity, and it's a theological reason, not a practical reason. The theological reason goes all the way back to the very first chapter of the Bible, that God created them male and female in his own image. So he endows people, including people of all genders, all ethnicities, people with disabilities. They're all endowed with the same amount of dignity, and
Right.
that has changed society. Right? You realize that that is the foundation of how Western society works. This idea that all people are created equal. Well, understand that is not just like an idea that everybody always has agreed with throughout history. Like you say to anybody, hey, all people are created equal. Well, people are in all over the world are going to look at you and say, are you joking, right? Like, no, that's not true.
Right.
Well, again, we come at this from the Bible. It's not like Jesus came and told us this for the first time. He was part of this long story of the Bible, which says in the very first page, all people are created by God and they have inherent dignity because they're created in the image of God.
Yeah.
And it's a really powerful and incredible thing. And, within 200 years of the writing of this letter, Christianity grew exponentially in the Roman Empire until the fact that the Roman Empire itself became Christian. And you could have a discussion about whether that was healthy or good or whatever for the church. But because of the influence of Christianity, slavery or bond servitude in this sense was outlawed within 200 years of the writing of this letter, because it changed from the inside out. If you treat your servants like your family, if you show them more honor and dignity than you would to someone who's your equal, how can it's going to change the way everything works? And it did. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really like how you brought up in the sermon that, you could be a master and slave and then walk into the church and suddenly you're sitting next to each other, worshiping together, listening to the sermon together, or even the slave could have a higher status than the master in the church. I thought that's just, it blows my mind. I think it would blow the minds of people that lived in that era. Absolutely incredible. I think we have time for one more. The verse 6, it really talks about the idea of sharing our faith, and it causes us to deepen our faith even more. That idea of allowing us allowing us to pour it into somebody else. It's almost like I hear sometimes people say the best way to learn something is to teach it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that concept.
Yeah, well, let me read the verse to you. It says this: I pray that the sharing of your faith may become effective. So here's the effect of sharing your faith: for the full knowledge of every good thing that is in us for the sake of Christ.
Yeah.
In other words, he's saying, Philemon, as you're ministering to this church that gathers in your house, or this, portion of the larger church in Colossae that meets in your house, I'm praying that as you minister to them, it will cause your faith to be deeper. I always say this: look, the number one way to grow your faith is to share your faith.
Yeah.
Because then you have to think about why you believe this. You have to give a reason for it, and you want to tell people and think about, articulate it. What was the journey along the way? What has he saved you from? And if you can explain that, that's why sharing your testimony is such a powerful thing. And so, he's saying, as you grow in this, or as you share your faith, you'll grow. You think about what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, where he says that God has chosen the weak things of this world to put to shame that which the world considers wise or strong. I've heard one person say this. He said, it's interesting that sometimes God calls people into ministry or into service because he knows that is what it's going to be. That's going to be the thing that helps them grow, that helps them stay faithful. And this is and so you say, oh, well, I'm not in ministry, so I guess that doesn't apply to me. No. Everybody is called to take part in this mission of God through Jesus. If you're a Christian, you're called to be part of the family business, which is serving. Yeah. Right? And serving others and being part of God's mission of seeking and saving the lost and furthering the kingdom of God. And so every person in the church, we always say, join a group, join a team. We want everyone in the church serving. Why? Because Jesus is servant. That's how we become like him. But also, that is part of the discipleship process. It's not just how we get stuff done. It's how we grow people, right? Through serving each other. We want to be like this man who introduced himself as the greatest servant who ever lived. So how do we become like him? Well, part of that is serving. And as you do, it helps you grow in even your own understanding of God's grace. So it's so incredibly important.
Yeah. Well, this week we have talked about multiple topics, really all stemming from the same book, Philemon. Normally, we often tackle one big topic, but this time we have changed it up a little bit, but I think it was very fulfilling, very fruitful. So make sure that you hit that like button and subscribe. Leave us a comment. Tell us if you have any questions or if you just want to encourage us as well.
And one more thing, speaking of servants, the servant, Jesus as the servant. We're starting a new series this Sunday.
That's right. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's called Servant Songs, and they're 4 and maybe 5
You'll have to see.
From Isaiah. We're probably going to do 5. Yeah, there's 4, but sometimes a 5th. And I really want to do all 5. So we're going to be looking at the 4 and maybe 5 servant songs in Isaiah 42 through 53 and maybe 61. So
it'll be a surprise.
It's not going to be that much. I kind of gave away the surprise.
Yeah, that's right. You ruined it.
Yeah.
But make sure you stay tuned for that, and we will see you next week.